You know what's worse than betrayal? Betrayal wrapped in celebration. I was sitting in my fully paid-off beach house, the one I'd spent a decade building my career to buy and finally own outright, when I saw it. My sister Emma Harrison posting in our family group chat that she'd just won the auction on my foreclosed property. Champagne emojis everywhere. Mom saying how proud she was. Dad joking about how he'd always known I'd bitten off more than I could chew. And me? I just stared at my phone, coffee in hand, waves crashing outside my window, wondering how my own family could celebrate what they thought was my total financial collapse without once, not once, asking if I was okay. The truth? There was no foreclosure. There never had been. 3 weeks earlier, I'd paid off the entire $1.2 million mortgage in one transaction, and I hadn't told anyone because I'd learned years ago that my victories were only safe when I kept them to myself. But here's what Emma didn't know, what none of them knew. Her auction was built on forged documents, fake signatures, and fraud so blatant that a bank VP was already on the phone with federal investigators. What happened next didn't just expose my sister's crime. It revealed decades of family betrayal I'd been too blind to see, and the karma that followed was more thorough than any revenge I could have planned. I couldn't believe what I was reading. There it was, right in the middle of our family group chat. Champagne emojis, congratulations flooding the screen, and my sister Emma announcing she'd just won the bid on my foreclosed beach house at auction. My beach house. The one I was literally sitting in at that exact moment, coffee in hand, watching the morning tide roll in like I did every single day. The messages kept coming. Mom saying how proud she was that Emma kept it in the family. Dad joking about how he'd always known that property was a money pit. Aunt Carol chiming in with some patronizing comment about how everything happens for a reason. I watched the celebration unfold in real time, each new message a fresh betrayal, and I didn't type a single word back. They were all so convinced of my failure, so eager to rewrite my story as their cautionary tale, that nobody, not one person, had bothered to ask me if any of it was actually true. The thing is, I'd stopped defending myself to them years ago. Every time I tried to share something I was proud of, a new client, a project that went well, recognition in my field, it either got ignored or twisted into something small. When I got promoted to senior consultant 3 years back, Mom's response was literally, "That's nice, honey, but Emma just made regional manager. When I paid off my car early, Dad said it was a waste because I should have invested that money instead. And when I bought this beach house back in 2019, the biggest purchase of my life, something I'd worked toward for years, the family reaction was lukewarm at best, like I'd bought a used couch instead of a $950K property on the coast. I'd spent a decade building the career that made the 2019 purchase possible, and they barely acknowledged it. So when I saw Emma's announcement, my first emotion wasn't shock. It was something colder, sharper. It was the sudden, crystallizing realization that they hadn't just dismissed my success. They'd been waiting, hoping, for me to fail. I sat there for maybe 20 minutes, just staring at my phone, reading and rereading the messages. The word foreclosure kept jumping out at me, so specific, so detailed. Emma had clearly done her homework, or thought she had. She mentioned the auction house, the date, even threw in some jargon about distressed properties and below market value. She sounded so authoritative, so certain, and everyone believed her without question. That's the thing about family betrayal. It's not always loud or obvious. Sometimes it's quiet, calculated, wrapped up in concern and good intentions. Sometimes it's your own sister acting like she's doing you a favor while she's actually trying to profit off what she thinks is your downfall. And the worst part? The family didn't just believe her story. They celebrated it. I thought about all the times I'd been the ghost in our family narrative, the invisible one, the one whose achievements didn't quite count. I thought about my so-called ghost ledger, this mental list I'd been keeping for years of every moment I was overlooked, every success that was rewritten as mediocrity, every time Emma got the applause for something I'd done first. College graduation? Emma's happened 6 months later and got the big party. My first business award? Barely mentioned. Emma's participation trophy from some corporate retreat, framed in my parents' living room. I'd told myself it didn't matter, that I didn't need their validation, that my self-worth wasn't tied to their approval. But sitting there, watching them cheer for my supposed failure, I realized something. They'd never seen me at all. They'd only ever seen the version of me they needed. The one who made Emma look better by comparison. And here's what really got me. The sheer audacity of it all. Emma wasn't just claiming my house was in foreclosure. She was saying she'd bought it, that she'd swooped in and saved the day, that she was the hero of this story. The level of delusion, of entitlement, of pure backstabbing required to not only believe I'd lost everything, but to actively try to take it from me, that takes a special kind of person. The kind who's been handed everything their whole life and still thinks they deserve more. The kind who sees their sister's perceived downfall not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. I'd always known Emma was jealous, the comments, the competition, the way she'd one-up everything I did. But this was different. This wasn't just envy. This was something darker, something that had been growing in the shadows of our family dynamic for years. But here's what Emma didn't know, what none of them knew, because I'd stopped sharing my life with them a long time ago. There was no foreclosure. There never had been. 3 weeks earlier, I'd made a single payment of $1. $2 million to the bank, wiping out the remaining mortgage in one transaction. The house was mine, fully paid, legally untouchable. I'd been planning it for months, saved every bonus, every consulting fee, lived below my means for years just to get to this moment of complete financial freedom. And I hadn't told anyone, not because I was hiding it, but because I'd learned that my victories were only safe when I kept them to myself. I'd learned that the moment I shared good news with my family, it would either be diminished, dismissed, or somehow turned into a reason to feel inadequate. So I stayed quiet. I built my life in silence. And now, that silence was about to become the loudest thing they'd ever heard. The house had always been more than just property to me. I bought it in 2019, with money I'd earned myself. No family loans, no co-signers, just years of grinding as an environmental consultant, taking on projects nobody else wanted, working weekends and holidays while Emma was posting brunch photos and complaining about her exhausting 9-to-5. Back then, the mortgage was $950K, and I remember my dad saying it was too much house for someone like me, whatever that meant. He said I was being impulsive, that I didn't understand real estate, that I'd probably regret it within a year. Mom just sighed and said she hoped I knew what I was doing. Emma? She didn't say anything at all, but I saw the look on her face, that tight smile, the one that never reaches her eyes, the one that says, "I can't believe you're getting something I don't have." I should have recognized that look for what it was, the beginning of resentment that would eventually turn into betrayal. What they didn't know, what they never bothered to ask about, was that I wasn't struggling. Not even close. My career had taken off in ways I never advertised, because I'd learned that success in our family was a zero-sum game. If I won, Emma felt like she lost, and the family would bend over backward to make sure she felt like a winner again. So I kept my head down. I took on high-paying contracts with tech companies needing environmental impact assessments, consulted for government agencies, built a reputation in my field that was solid and respected. The money came in steadily, quietly, and I saved most of it. No flashy cars, no designer bags, no Instagram-worthy vacations. Just discipline, planning, and a very clear goal: own this house outright before I turned 40. I hit that goal 3 weeks before Emma's little foreclosure fantasy, and nobody knew because I never gave them the chance to minimize it. The $1.2 million payment wasn't reckless or impulsive. It was strategic. I'd been watching interest rates, calculating the long-term savings, and when the numbers made sense, I pulled the trigger. One wire transfer, one confirmation email, and suddenly I was living mortgage-free in a property that had already appreciated by nearly 30% since I bought it. The bank sent me a congratulatory letter, the kind with embossed letterhead and a personal note from some VP I'd never met, thanking me for my business and noting what an exceptional financial position I was in. I remember reading that letter on my deck, overlooking the ocean, feeling this quiet sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with anyone else's approval. For the first time in my life, I'd achieved something major, and I didn't feel the need to share it, defend it, or justify it to my family. That freedom felt better than the house itself. But here's the thing about secrets. They only stay secret until someone tries to exploit what they think they know. Emma had clearly done some digging, probably searched public records, maybe even called around to real estate agents asking about distressed properties in my area. She must have seen my original mortgage filing from 2019 and assumed I was still paying it, or worse, that I'd fallen behind. The fact that she never once called me, never asked if I was okay, never offered help before jumping straight to, "I'm buying your house at auction." That tells you everything about her intentions. This wasn't concern. This wasn't family looking out for family. This was opportunism dressed up as charity, revenge disguised as rescue. She wanted my house, sure. But more than that, she wanted the story. She wanted to be the one who succeeded where I failed, the golden child who swooped in and saved the day while I crumbled. What Emma didn't understand, what none of them understood, was that I'd been documenting everything. Not because I was paranoid, but because I'd learned early on that in a family where your truth gets rewritten to suit someone else's narrative, evidence is your only defense. I had bank statements, payment confirmations, letters from my mortgage company, emails with my financial advisor. I had proof of every payment, every transaction, every single dollar that went into that house. I even had the deed, freshly updated, sitting in a fireproof safe in my home office. I wasn't preparing for a battle. I was preparing for the moment when the truth would be impossible to ignore, when the family's preferred version of reality would crash headfirst into actual, documented facts. And that moment was coming faster than any of them realized. The morning after Emma's announcement, I woke up early and did what I always do. Made coffee, checked my emails, looked out at the water. There was something almost surreal about the normalcy of it all, knowing that somewhere across town, my family was probably already planning how they'd redecorate Emma's beach house, talking about property values and investment potential like I was already erased from the equation. Part of me wanted to message the group chat right then, to drop the truth like a bomb and watch the fallout in real time. But I didn't, because I'd learned something valuable over the years. People who are determined to believe the worst about you will always find a way to justify it, and people who celebrate your failure don't deserve to witness your success. So I waited. I drank my coffee. I watched the sunrise, and I let them enjoy their little fantasy for just a bit longer. The thing about being the invisible child is that it doesn't happen all at once. It's not like one day you're seen and valued and the next you're a ghost. It's gradual, systematic, like erosion. So slow, you don't even notice you're disappearing until you look back and realize you've been fading for years. I started keeping what I called my ghost ledger about 5 years ago. Just a notes app on my phone where I'd jot down little moments that probably seemed insignificant to everyone else but cut deep for me. The time I got published in a major environmental journal, and Mom's only response was, "That's nice. Did you see Emma made the company newsletter?" The Christmas when I brought homemade gifts I'd spent weeks on, and Emma showed up with expensive store-bought items and got all the praise for being so thoughtful. Every single family dinner where my stories got interrupted halfway through, but Emma's got listened to with rapt attention, like she was delivering the Sermon on the Mount instead of complaining about her commute. At first, I told myself I was being sensitive, that I was imagining things, that every family has dynamics and maybe I just needed thicker skin. But the ledger kept growing. My promotion, barely acknowledged. Emma's lateral move to a different department, celebrated like she'd won the Nobel Prize. My work with a nonprofit that helped restore coastal ecosystems. That's nice. But when are you going to get a real corporate job like your sister? The time I paid off my student loans 5 years early? Dad actually frowned and said I should have kept paying the minimum and invested the difference. Never mind that Emma was still making interest-only payments on hers and nobody said a word. Every achievement I had was either minimized, criticized, or completely ignored, while Emma's most basic accomplishments were treated like historic events worthy of their own national holiday. What made it worse was the gaslighting. And I don't use that word lightly. Anytime I tried to bring up how I felt, how it hurt to be constantly overlooked, I was told I was making things up, or being dramatic, or jealous of my sister's success. They'd rewrite history right in front of me, swearing they'd congratulated me on things they definitely hadn't, claiming they'd been supportive when the evidence, my own memories, text messages, emails, said otherwise. It got to the point where I started screenshotting conversations just to prove to myself I wasn't crazy, that I wasn't inventing this pattern of erasure, and the screenshots confirmed what I already knew. In our family's collective memory, I was either a side character in Emma's story, or a cautionary tale about what happens when you don't follow the approved path. I was never the protagonist of my own life, at least not in their version of it. The emotional theft wasn't just about recognition, though. It was about identity, about self-worth, about the fundamental human need to be seen by the people who are supposed to know you best. Every time they ignored my successes, they weren't just being dismissive. They were telling me that nothing I did would ever be good enough, that I would never measure up to Emma, that my value as a family member was conditional on staying small and unthreatening. And for a long time, I believed them. I internalized that message, made myself smaller, stopped sharing good news, stopped expecting anything from them. I convinced myself that dignity meant not needing their approval, that self-worth came from within. And while that's true, it does come from within. It doesn't make the rejection hurt any less. It doesn't erase the years of feeling like an outsider in your own family, like you're constantly auditioning for a role you'll never get. But here's what they didn't count on. Being invisible gives you a certain kind of power. When nobody's paying attention to you, you can build an entire life they know nothing about. You can make decisions, take risks, achieve things that would get scrutinized or criticized if they were watching. My family thought they knew me, the struggling younger sister, the one who made questionable choices, the one who wasn't quite as successful as Emma. But the person they'd created in their minds had nothing to do with who I actually was. I'd built a career they didn't understand, accumulated wealth they didn't know about, created a life that was stable, fulfilling, and entirely mine. The ghost ledger had hundreds of entries by now, a comprehensive record of every slight, every dismissal, every moment of betrayal disguised as family concern. And I kept adding to it, not because I was bitter, but because I needed to remember. Looking back at that ledger now, with Emma's foreclosure lie fresh in my mind, I could see the pattern so clearly. This wasn't new behavior. It was the inevitable escalation of years of resentment and entitlement. They'd spent so long telling me I was less than that they'd started to believe it themselves. And when belief turns into expectation, expectation turns into opportunity. Emma didn't just think my house was in foreclosure. She wanted it to be, needed it to be, because my failure made her success more legitimate. And the family went along with it because it fit their narrative, because it was easier to believe I'd screwed up than to acknowledge they'd been wrong about me all along. But narratives can only survive if everyone agrees on them, and I was about to introduce a version of the truth that no amount of rewriting could change. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon, exactly 48 hours after Emma's announcement. I was in my home office reviewing reports when my phone rang, not my cell, but my landline, the number only banks and official institutions have. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, and for a split second I considered letting it go to voicemail, but something made me pick up. "Ms. Harrison?" A man's voice said, professional, but with an edge of urgency I couldn't quite place. "This is Marcus Webb, Vice President of Residential Lending at Coastal Federal Bank. Do you have a moment to discuss a rather unusual situation regarding your property at 847 Shoreline Drive?" My stomach dropped, not because I was worried, but because I just knew, that whatever was about to happen would be the moment everything shifted. Marcus didn't waste time with pleasantries. He explained that the bank had received notification of a foreclosure auction scheduled for my property, which immediately triggered an internal review because their records showed my mortgage had been paid in full 3 weeks prior. "That's correct," I said, keeping my voice steady even though my heart was racing. "I made a lump sum payment of $1.2 million on the 15th of last month. The loan is closed." There was a pause, and I could hear him typing in the background. "Yes, We have that payment confirmed and processed, which makes the auction filing extremely problematic. Ms. Harrison, someone has submitted fraudulent documentation to the county clerk's office claiming your property is in default and initiating foreclosure proceedings. It wasn't a real foreclosure from scratch. It was a paper foreclosure, the kind that collapses the second someone checks the bank's internal records. We've already contacted our legal team in the county, but I need to ask you directly. Do you know who might have filed these documents? I sat there for a moment, phone pressed to my ear, watching the ocean through my window and feeling the strange, cold clarity wash over me. Yes, I said finally. I believe my sister Emma Harrison filed them. She announced in our family group chat 2 days ago that she'd won a bid on my foreclosed beach house at auction. She even mentioned specific details about the auction date and the property value. Marcus went quiet for a second, and when he spoke again, his tone had shifted from professional to something harder, more serious. Ms. Harrison, if what you're saying is accurate, we're looking at multiple criminal violations: mortgage fraud, falsification of legal documents, attempted theft by deception. This isn't a civil matter anymore. This is fraud, and it involves a significant amount of money. The auction was set up with a certified check for $780,000 made out to the county, money that supposedly came from a family trust to facilitate the purchase. It was well below market, exactly the kind of bargain foreclosure auctions promise. The number hit me like a physical blow. $780,000. Emma had somehow gotten her hands on nearly $1 million and was prepared to use it to buy my house out from under me. A house she thought I'd lost. A house she believed was her karmic payback for whatever imagined slight she'd been nursing for years. There is no family trust, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. At least not one I'm aware of. And I certainly never authorized any foreclosure proceedings or auction. Marcus was typing again, faster now, and I could hear other voices in the background, people being pulled into the conversation. Ms. Harrison, I need you to know that we take this extremely seriously. Coastal Federal has zero tolerance for fraud, and we're already in contact with law enforcement. The auction has been suspended pending investigation, and all funds associated with the transaction have been frozen. I'll need you to come into the branch tomorrow to provide a formal statement and review the documentation that was filed. Before I hung up, Marcus said something that stuck with me, something that made the whole situation click into terrible, perfect focus. Ms. Harrison, the person who filed these documents had access to very specific information about your original mortgage. The loan number, the purchase date, the initial amount borrowed. This wasn't some random scam. Whoever did this knew details that only family or someone with illegal access to financial records would know. I thanked him, ended the call, and sat there in the silence of my paid-off house, staring at my phone and thinking about all the times Emma had asked innocent questions about my finances over the years. How's the mortgage treating you? Still making those payments okay? Ever thought about selling and downsizing? Questions I'd deflected or ignored because I'd stopped sharing my real life with her long ago, but questions that now felt like reconnaissance, like she'd been gathering intelligence for exactly this moment. I didn't call Emma. I didn't message the family group chat. I didn't do anything except sit there and let the reality of what had almost happened sink in. My own sister had tried to steal my house using fake documents and family money, had celebrated publicly about taking advantage of my supposed failure, and had done it all with the family's blessing and encouragement. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that it almost felt surreal. Like I was watching it happen to someone else, some character in a story about family dysfunction and revenge. But it wasn't a story. It was my life, my family, and the justice that was coming wasn't going to be the kind you see in movies where everyone apologizes and hugs it out. This was institutional justice, the kind with lawyers and police reports and consequences that don't disappear with a heartfelt conversation. The next morning, I walked into Coastal Federal Bank wearing my best professional outfit. Not because I needed to impress anyone, but because I wanted to look like exactly what I was. Someone who had her life together. Someone who paid off $1 million mortgage in cash. Someone who couldn't be erased or rewritten no matter how hard my family tried. Marcus Webb met me in a private conference room along with the bank's chief legal counsel, a woman named Patricia Chen, who had the kind of sharp, no-nonsense energy that told me she'd seen every scam in the book and wasn't impressed by any of them. They had printouts spread across the table: the fraudulent foreclosure filing, the auction notice, copies of checks, and a paper trail that told a story Emma probably thought she'd covered up. "Ms. Harrison," Patricia said, sliding a document toward me. "This is the signature on the foreclosure filing. Is this your signature?" I looked at it for maybe 2 seconds. "No, that's not even close to my signature." What happened next moved faster than I expected. Patricia explained that the moment they'd confirmed fraud, they'd contacted the county clerk's office and had the auction canceled with immediate effect. The $780,000 certified check Emma had submitted, money she'd apparently convinced our parents to withdraw from their retirement account as an investment opportunity to buy their daughter's foreclosed property and keep it in the family, was now frozen pending a criminal investigation. It wasn't some trust. It was my parents' retirement money, dressed up with a nicer name. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit had been notified because the fraud crossed state lines when Emma used interstate wire transfers to move the money. Local detectives would handle the interviews while federal agents followed the wire trail. "We're not just talking about a family dispute here," Marcus said, his voice measured but firm. "We're talking about mortgage fraud, identity theft, falsification of legal documents, and conspiracy to commit theft. These are federal charges with serious prison time attached." I sat there absorbing it all, feeling something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, not vindication, but a strange, heavy sadness that it had come to this. Within hours, my phone started buzzing. First it was Mom, hysterical, asking if I knew that the bank had frozen Emma's auction money and demanding I call them to fix this misunderstanding. Then Dad, angry, accusing me of sabotaging Emma's investment and asking why I couldn't just let her help the family for once. Then Aunt Carol, then Emma's friends, then random family members I hadn't spoken to in years. All with the same message. I was being selfish, vindictive, cruel for not letting Emma buy the house, for making a big deal out of what was clearly just a miscommunication. Not one of them asked me if the foreclosure was real. Not one of them questioned why Emma would file legal documents without talking to me first. They'd already decided I was the villain in this story, and no amount of facts or evidence was going to change that narrative. So I didn't answer any of the calls. I didn't defend myself. I just forwarded every message to Patricia Chen and let the legal system do what it does best: follow the money. The family group chat exploded that afternoon. Emma posted a long, rambling message about how this was all a huge mistake, how she'd been trying to help, how she'd heard from a reliable source that my house was in foreclosure, and she was just stepping in before a stranger bought it. She said she had documentation, proof, evidence that the foreclosure was real, and that I was the one lying. Mom backed her up immediately, saying Emma would never lie about something this serious, that there must be some banking error, that families are supposed to support each other, and I was tearing everyone apart over money. Dad chimed in with some comment about how he'd always known this house was going to cause problems, how I'd bitten off more than I could chew, and how Emma was just being the responsible one by taking action. I read every message, screenshot every single one, and didn't type a word back. Because here's what they didn't understand. I didn't need to defend myself anymore. The truth wasn't subject to a family vote. By the end of the week, the county had opened a formal investigation, and detectives had started interviewing everyone involved. Emma was questioned at her workplace. She worked at a different bank, ironically, in their mortgage division, which made her fraud even more egregious because she knew exactly what she was doing and how illegal it was. The investigators discovered she'd used her professional access to pull my financial records without authorization, a separate crime that violated federal banking privacy laws. She didn't have my bank's internal file, but she had enough from public records, old paperwork, and industry tools she wasn't supposed to touch. She'd forged my signature on multiple documents, created fake correspondence that made it look like I'd been in contact with foreclosure attorneys, and even fabricated emails that supposedly showed me agreeing to let her buy the house. The level of premeditation was stunning. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment mistake or a misunderstanding. This was a calculated, months-long scheme to steal my property, and she'd involved our parents, their retirement money, their reputations, without telling them the whole truth. The moment the bank froze the funds and the investigation went public, I watched my family's narrative crumble in real time. Suddenly, people weren't congratulating Emma anymore. Suddenly, the group chat got very quiet. Suddenly, I started getting private messages from cousins and extended family asking what really happened, if I was okay, if there was anything they could do. The same people who'd celebrated my supposed downfall were now trying to distance themselves from the wreckage, trying to rewrite their own roles in the story. But I had the screenshots. I had the evidence. I had proof of every celebration, every cruel comment, every moment they'd chosen to believe the worst about me without question. And while I didn't plan to use it against them, revenge wasn't the point. I kept it all, because memory is selective and truth needs witnesses. The formal charges came down 6 weeks later, and they were worse than even I'd imagined. Emma was indicted on 4 federal counts: mortgage fraud, identity theft, falsification of legal documents, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The state added 3 more charges related to her unauthorized access of my financial records through her bank's system, a violation so severe that federal banking regulators got involved. I wasn't there when she was arrested. I found out through a terse text from my mother that just said, "Are you happy now?" With no context, no acknowledgement of what Emma had actually done. Just blame directed at me for not making it all go away. Later, I heard from a mutual acquaintance that Emma had been escorted out of her office in handcuffs during business hours, that her coworkers had watched in shock as federal agents walked her through the lobby. The humiliation she'd tried to engineer for me had circled back and landed squarely on her. The legal proceedings moved with the kind of cold efficiency that only happens when the evidence is overwhelming and the defendant has no real defense. Emma's lawyer tried to argue it was a family misunderstanding, that she genuinely believed the house was in foreclosure based on information she'd received. But the prosecution tore that apart in minutes. They had her search history showing she'd researched how to file fraudulent foreclosure documents. They had emails where she'd discussed the opportunity to buy my house with our parents, painting me as financially irresponsible and desperate. They had her digital fingerprints all over fake documents, forged signatures, fabricated correspondence. The prosecutor said something in court that I'll never forget. This wasn't a mistake. This was a predatory scheme designed to exploit what the defendant believed was her sister's vulnerability. She didn't try to help. She tried to profit. And the judge, looking at Emma with something close to disgust, agreed. My father was implicated as a co-conspirator, though he ultimately wasn't charged criminally. The prosecutors determined he'd been manipulated by Emma, fed false information about my supposed financial crisis, and genuinely believed he was helping save the family home. But that didn't shield him from consequences. The $780,000 he and Mom had pulled from their retirement account to fund Emma's scheme, frozen as proceeds of attempted fraud. Their bank launched its own investigation into how they'd withdrawn such a large sum without triggering any alerts. And while they'd eventually get some of the money back, the legal fees and penalties would eat up a significant portion. Dad had to hire his own attorney, had to give depositions, had to explain to investigators how he could hand over nearly $1 million without once verifying that the foreclosure was real or asking me directly if I needed help. The answer, of course, was simple. He'd wanted to believe I was failing because it confirmed everything he'd always thought about my choices. Emma's professional life collapsed overnight. In the months leading up to sentencing, her bank terminated her employment immediately, citing the unauthorized access to customer financial records and the criminal charges. But it went further than that. She was effectively barred from working in any FDIC-insured financial institution, a blacklist that ended her entire career. The mortgage fraud conviction meant she couldn't work in real estate either, couldn't get licensed, couldn't even work as a loan processor or title agent. Every door in the industry she'd built her identity around slammed shut, and she had no one to blame but herself. I heard through the family grapevine that she'd applied for jobs in other fields, retail, administration, anything. But the felony conviction came up in every background check, and the nature of the crime made employers hesitant. She'd gone from regional manager with a corner office to virtually unemployable in less than 6 months. The sentencing hearing was the first time I'd seen Emma face to face since this whole nightmare started. She looked smaller somehow, diminished, wearing a conservative suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, but couldn't hide the defeat in her eyes. Her lawyer made a plea for leniency, talked about her previously clean record, her contributions to the community, her family responsibilities. The judge listened patiently, then sentenced her to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release and full restitution, which included paying back the legal fees the bank had incurred, the investigation costs, and a fine that would take her years to pay off. Emma cried, which surprised me. Not because I thought she was incapable of emotion, but because I'd never seen her cry about anything that didn't directly benefit her. Mom sobbed in the gallery. Dad sat stone-faced, and I just watched, feeling nothing but a profound sense of closure. After the sentencing, I walked out of that courthouse into bright afternoon sunshine and felt lighter than I had in years. Not because I enjoyed seeing Emma punished. I didn't, not really. But because the truth had been acknowledged by an authority that couldn't be manipulated or gaslit or rewritten to suit someone else's narrative. A federal judge had looked at the evidence and said, "This was wrong. This was criminal. There are consequences." And for someone who'd spent years being told her reality didn't matter, that validation, cold and institutional as it was, meant everything. Justice wasn't revenge. Justice was simply the world confirming what I'd always known. I hadn't failed. I hadn't deserved what they tried to do to me. And no amount of family loyalty or wishful thinking could change the facts. The ripple effects of Emma's conviction spread wider than anyone anticipated. Within days of her sentencing, the story hit local news. Not because I wanted it to, but because mortgage fraud involving a bank employee and nearly $1 million is exactly the kind of scandal that media outlets love. Former bank manager sentenced for attempting to steal sister's home, read one headline. Sibling rivalry turns criminal, woman jailed for foreclosure fraud, read another. Her mugshot circulated online, shared in professional groups and financial crime forums, becoming a cautionary tale about insider fraud and family betrayal. I didn't comment on any of it, didn't give interviews, didn't engage with the public spectacle of her downfall. But I watched from a distance as her entire carefully constructed professional identity disintegrated in real time, becoming a warning to others rather than the success story she'd always wanted to be. The professional consequences went beyond just losing her job. Emma had spent years building a network in the banking and real estate industries, LinkedIn connections, professional associations, mentorship relationships, all of it. After the conviction, I heard from people in her field that she'd been quietly removed from industry groups, uninvited from conferences, dropped from email lists. Her professional reputation, which she'd valued more than almost anything, was destroyed so completely that even people who didn't know the details of her case distanced themselves from her. Nobody wants to be associated with a convicted fraudster, especially in industries built on trust and ethical conduct. The career she'd spent over a decade building, the identity she'd wrapped herself in, the status that had made her feel superior to me, all of it gone because she couldn't stand the thought of me succeeding without her permission. What struck me most wasn't the loss itself, but Emma's complete inability to take responsibility for it. Through mutual acquaintances, I heard she was telling people she'd been set up, that I'd somehow manipulated the legal system against her, that the charges were exaggerated and politically motivated. She claimed she'd been trying to help me and got caught up in bureaucratic red tape, conveniently leaving out the forged signatures, the fake documents, the unauthorized access to my financial records. Even in the face of overwhelming evidence that had convinced a federal prosecutor, a grand jury, and a judge, she couldn't admit what she'd done. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain her version of events was staggering, and it told me everything I needed to know about why our family had functioned the way it did for so long. Accountability wasn't just absent. It was actively resisted, rewritten, denied, until reality itself became negotiable. My father's role in the collapse was quieter, but no less devastating. While he avoided criminal charges, he couldn't escape the financial and social consequences. The retirement account they'd drained to fund Emma's scheme was eventually partially restored, minus tens of thousands in legal fees, penalties, and lost investment growth. But worse than the money was the realization that spread through their social circle, the country club set, the church friends, the neighbors they'd known for decades, that he'd been involved in a fraud scheme, that he'd pulled out nearly $1 million to help his daughter steal property from his other daughter. People talked. Invitations dried up. Dad's weekly golf games got awkward and then stopped altogether. He'd spent his whole life building a reputation as a shrewd businessman, someone who made smart investments and knew how to manage money. And in one spectacular failure of judgment, that reputation shattered. Mom tried to rebuild bridges, calling me periodically with these hollow apologies that always came with conditions. "I'm sorry this happened, but you have to understand Emma was just trying to help. I know things got out of hand, but family is family, and we need to move past this. Your father is devastated. Can't you just forgive and forget?" Each call was the same pattern. Acknowledge that something bad happened. Minimize Emma's role. Blame external circumstances, and then ask me to be the bigger person by pretending none of it mattered. I listened politely, said very little, and eventually stopped answering. Because here's what she couldn't understand. Forgiveness isn't the same as reconciliation. And moving past something doesn't mean pretending it never happened. Emma had committed multiple felonies trying to steal my home. That's not a family disagreement you get over with a heartfelt conversation and a holiday dinner. The most surprising collapse came from unexpected places. Emma's friends, the ones who'd congratulated her in the group chat, who'd liked her posts, who'd been part of her carefully curated social circle. One by one, they distanced themselves, stopped commenting on her social media, quietly unfollowed and unfriended. I heard that some of them had realized, in the aftermath, that Emma had been lying to them too, borrowing money she never repaid, exaggerating her success, talking trash about them behind their backs. Her conviction had given people permission to see her clearly, to acknowledge patterns they'd been ignoring, to admit that maybe they'd never really trusted her either. The karma wasn't just legal or professional. It was social, emotional, a complete dismantling of the identity she'd constructed through manipulation and performance. In the years that followed, I focused on building a life that had nothing to do with the family I'd been born into. I still lived in the beach house, my beach house, paid off, legally untouchable, surrounded by the sound of waves and the smell of salt air. My consulting work had taken off in ways I'd never imagined, not because of what happened with Emma, but in spite of it. I'd won a national award for my work on coastal restoration, been invited to speak at conferences, published research that actually mattered. Local news had done a feature on my environmental projects, and when the reporter asked about my background, I gave them the professional version: education, career trajectory, passion for the work, and left out the part about my sister trying to steal my house. That story belonged to the past, and I was done letting it define me. The recognition felt different this time. It wasn't about proving anything to my family, or seeking validation from people who'd never valued me. It was just real. Colleagues respected my work because it was good work. Clients hired me because I delivered results. The environmental community knew my name because I'd earned it through years of consistent effort and expertise. Nobody cared that I'd once been the invisible daughter in a dysfunctional family, that I'd survived betrayal and fraud, that I'd had to fight for basic dignity. They cared about what I could do, what I'd accomplished, the value I brought to projects and partnerships. For the first time in my life, I was being seen for who I actually was, not who someone else needed me to be, and it was quietly, profoundly liberating. I'd cut ties with my family completely, not dramatically, not with some big confrontation or final statement, just a gradual withdrawal that eventually became permanent. I stopped responding to Mom's calls, blocked Dad's number after he sent one too many messages asking me to help Emma get back on her feet after her release from prison, unfollowed every family member on social media, changed my address with institutions so nothing could be forwarded to them. It wasn't revenge. It was survival, self-preservation, the recognition that some relationships are so toxic that the only healthy response is complete separation. I'd spent decades trying to earn their love, their approval, their basic acknowledgement, and what I'd gotten in return was years of dismissal, culminating in an attempted theft. I didn't owe them anything, least of all access to the life I'd built without them. The house itself had become more than just property. It was proof. Tangible, undeniable proof that I'd succeeded on my own terms, that I'd built something valuable and defended it against people who tried to take it from me. Every morning when I woke up and looked out at the ocean, I remembered that this was mine, that I'd earned every square foot of it, that no amount of family dysfunction or betrayal could change that fact. I'd redecorated over the years, made it feel more like home and less like a defensive position, added a garden, renovated the deck, filled the rooms with art and books and things that made me happy. The house stopped being a symbol of what I'd survived and became simply the place where I lived, where I was happy, where I belonged. Sometimes I thought about Emma, wondered how she was doing, if she'd learned anything from what happened. I heard through distant acquaintances that she'd moved out of state after her release, was working some administrative job that barely paid her bills, still living with the consequences of her choices. Part of me felt sad for her. Not regret, not guilt, but a kind of distant sadness for the person she could have been if she hadn't let jealousy and entitlement consume her. We could have been close, could have supported each other, could have built the kind of sisterhood people write about, but that required her to see me as a person rather than competition, to celebrate my success rather than resent it, to love me without conditions or comparisons. And she'd never been capable of that. Maybe she still wasn't. The victory, if you could call it that, wasn't about Emma's punishment, or my family's regret, or any external validation of who was right and who was wrong. The victory was internal, personal, the quiet satisfaction of knowing I'd survived something that should have destroyed me and came out stronger. I'd reclaimed not just my house, but my dignity, my self-worth, my right to exist without apologizing for taking up space. I'd proven, to myself, which was the only audience that mattered, that I could build a life worth living without the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. And every single day I spent in that house, in that life, in that hard-won peace, was proof that family isn't always the people you're born to. The real closure didn't come from the court case or the conviction, or even the years of silence that followed. It came one afternoon, about a year after Emma's sentencing, when I was sitting on my deck with a glass of wine watching the sunset, and I realized I hadn't thought about my family in weeks, not with anger, not with sadness, not with anything. They'd simply stopped occupying space in my mind, stopped being the measuring stick against which I evaluated my worth. I'd spent so many years carrying the weight of their rejection, analyzing every interaction, trying to understand what I'd done wrong, or how I could have been different. And then one day, without even noticing when it happened, I'd just let it go. Not through forgiveness, not through some therapeutic breakthrough, but through the simple, gradual process of building a life so full and satisfying that there was no room left for people who'd only ever diminished me. I'd learned something fundamental about family during those years of separation, something I wish someone had told me decades earlier. Blood doesn't create obligation. Being related to someone doesn't mean you owe them access to your life, your success, your peace. Family is supposed to be the people who see you, who celebrate you, who show up when things are hard and cheer when things are good. And if the people you're related to can't do that, if they're actively rooting for your failure, trying to profit from your perceived downfall, or treating your existence as an inconvenience, then they're not family in any meaningful sense. They're just people you happen to share DNA with, and you don't owe DNA anything. The freedom that came with accepting that truth was bigger than any victory in court, more satisfying than any professional recognition. I thought a lot about the concept of closure, about what it actually means to move on from trauma or betrayal. For years, I'd thought closure required some kind of resolution with my family, an apology, an acknowledgement, maybe even reconciliation. But that's not what closure is. Closure isn't something other people give you. It's something you give yourself when you stop waiting for them to be different. Stop hoping they'll suddenly see your value. Stop believing that if you just explain it right, or achieve enough, or prove yourself in the right way, they'll finally love you the way you deserve to be loved all along. Closure is accepting that they are who they are, that they probably won't change, and that their limitations aren't a reflection of your worth. It's closing a door you've been holding open for people who had no intention of walking through it. The emotional account I'd been trying to balance for decades, the ghost ledger, the tally of moments I'd been overlooked or diminished. I finally closed it. Not by settling the debt or getting even, but by recognizing the account itself was fraudulent. I'd been operating under the assumption that if I just accumulated enough achievements, enough success, enough proof of my value, eventually my family would acknowledge me, and the ledger would balance. But that's not how dysfunctional families work. The game was rigged from the start. No amount of success would ever be enough because the problem wasn't my achievements. It was their need to see me as less than to maintain their own sense of superiority and order. Once I understood that, the ledger stopped mattering. I wasn't keeping score anymore because I'd left the game entirely. There were moments, especially in the beginning, when I missed them. Not who they actually were, but who I'd wanted them to be. The parents who celebrated my success, the sister who had my back, the family that felt like home instead of a battlefield. I grieved that fantasy family, mourned the relationship we'd never have, let myself feel the sadness of being fundamentally alone in the world in ways that people with healthy families can't quite understand. But grief, real grief, has an end point. You feel it, you sit with it, you let it move through you, and eventually it transforms into something else. Acceptance, peace, maybe even gratitude for what you learned about resilience and self-reliance. I came out the other side knowing exactly who I was and what I was capable of, and that knowledge was worth more than any family approval could ever be. Now, when people ask if I'm close with my family, I smile and say something vague like, "We're not in touch much," and change the subject. I don't tell the whole story because most people can't hold the complexity of it. The fraud, the betrayal, the years of emotional abuse disguised as family dynamics. They want family stories to have happy endings, reconciliations, lessons learned, and relationships restored. But my ending is different and it's still happy, just not in the way people expect. I'm happy because I'm free. Free from the constant weight of trying to earn love that was never going to be freely given. Free from the narrative that said I was the problem. Free from people who celebrated my failures and resented my success. I live in my beautiful house by the ocean, do work that matters, build relationships with people who actually see me, and every single day is proof that family isn't about blood, or obligation, or shared history. Family is about presence, about showing up, about choosing to see and value someone for who they actually are. And the family I've built for myself, friends, colleagues, mentors, chosen people, that family is real in ways my biological family never was. So here's what I want to know. Have you ever been the invisible one in your family? The one whose achievements got erased? Whose success made others uncomfortable? Whose failures were celebrated louder than your wins? Have you ever had someone close to you? A sibling, a parent, someone who was supposed to love you, actively root for your downfall because your success threatened their narrative? I want to hear your stories in the comments below, because I know I'm not alone in this. Tell me about the moment you realized your family saw you as competition instead of kin, or the time you discovered that the people cheering loudest for your failure were the ones sitting at your dinner table. And if you've found your way out, if you've built a life beyond their validation, I want to hear about that too. How did you reclaim your dignity? What did freedom look like on the other side of betrayal? Drop your truth below, the messy, complicated, real version, because these stories matter, and somebody reading this right now needs to know they're not crazy for feeling what they feel. And if this resonated with you, if you felt seen in ways that made you uncomfortable or validated, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we're going deep into family dynamics, justice, and the kind of revenge that comes from simply refusing to stay small. More stories like this are coming. More truths that don't get talked about at family dinners. More proof that sometimes the most radical act of self-love is walking away from people who never valued you in the first place. I'll see you in the next one.